Today we'll talk about the lessons we learned from developing Jetpack. But a brief history before we start. So Jetpack was actually initially born as support library. So the goal was to address the Android fragmentation such that when we add a new functionality to the operating system, we would also write this in the support library, which backports the functionality in the older versions. Couple of years later, actually, this is when I joined, we started doing primary development in the support library whenever we can, because it really doesn't make sense to implement everything twice like we did for fragments before. A couple of years later, we started expanding the support library to include more opinionated libraries. So in the early days, it was just very fundamental stuff you have to use. And with these opinionated libraries, we added more optional, but still very useful libraries. And as we did that, it became the primary development surface for developers. So we rebranded it to Jetpack because turns out nobody wants to use something called support library. And we also started using semantic versioning, which was very important for us. A couple of years later, we announced Compose, our new UI toolkit. And today, we have more than 100 projects in it, and more than 200 developers contribute. So it's fairly big. And in the early days of support library, you basically had an idea, you implemented it, and you shipped it. It was very straightforward and simple. These days, it's a lot more complicated. So when you have an idea, you first submit a one-pager. This is like a short document that describes your library, what you're trying to achieve, how you will support it, and so on. These one-pagers get reviewed in a group we call Jetpack Working Group. So the goal here is to make sure this library fits into the Jetpack umbrella. Like, is it fully open source? Is that going to be supported properly? These are the things we look at. And now oftentimes we also provide some feedback to the developer. Assuming this goes well, you update your design based on this feedback. You do user experience research, the early access programs where you share an early version of your library with developers and get feedback. And then finally, when you have your implementation, it goes through this group called API Council, where they look at all of your APIs and make sure they're consistent with the rest of Jetpack. Now, finally, you go through the alpha beta release cycle. Now, let's talk about APIs. What is an API? On the most technical terms, API is all of the public classes, interfaces, properties you provide in your library. In practical terms, this also includes the behavior of your library, even though it's not very clear. Now, there's a better way to define APIs. I like it a lot. It's coming from Chet Haas. So one day in the office, Chet said, APIs are like kids, except kids leave for college. Your APIs live in your basement forever. And this is such a proper definition of APIs. Once you create an API, you have to live with it. You have to support it going forward. So the bar is very high. Now, when you develop a library, you usually have like an initial very consistent design. You add some features. Now, people want to use it together, so you add another API to make them usable together. You have some bug fixes and add more features on top of it. And naturally, you end up with this mess. And if you don't want to end up in this mess, from day one, you need to pick your target use case and your demographic and stick to it. Like, you need to know what you are trying to solve and what are your users, or who are your users. And we made a lot of mistakes here. So one of the things was data binding, a library I worked on. In data binding, we let you write like simple expressions in your XML, and it gets updated automatically. So you could say, if you have a user object, you could say, grab the name and put it into this text view, which makes a lot of sense. Now, as we implemented that, we're like, oh, wouldn't that be cool if we let people concatenate strings, which, is very obvious, is very readable, is a nice feature to add. But once we started adding that expression language, one thing led to another. We ended up having a fairly complicated expression language. And the result was this. Now, I didn't make this up. I grabbed this from Stack Overflow. Basically, by not thinking through this expression language very carefully, we kind of incentivize people to create expressions like this. This was never our intention, but we did let it happen. So that was a bad example where we failed. And we have good examples too. Room is Android's database library, and it gives you this API where you can write a query and it's going to return your objects based on the query. And when we first had the early access program for Room and showed it to other people, one of the primary feedbacks we received was, can you add a builder API? Now, if you ever used an ORM in Java or Kotlin, a builder API usually looks something like this. Like you can just build a SQL query using Java or Kotlin, and you get auto-completion. You know you're building a correct query. When this feedback arrived, we did actually ignore it, and that wasn't easy. But the reason why we ignored that feedback was initially like it didn't align with the goals of Room. While developing Room, we wanted to incentivize people to write SQL because it's very powerful, easy to write. And a builder completely hides that. Second, if we got that wrong, we can always add a builder API. But if we add a builder API, we can never remove it. So it was easy to defer it. And finally, but most importantly, why do developers want a builder API? And there are two primary reasons. The first one is IDE support, right? You want it to autocomplete as you type. And turns out this is a problem we can solve because we have Android Studio and we added code completion for these SQL queries. And the second part is that people want to make sure their queries are correct, which is something else we can do as well, because during your compilation, we can validate these queries and fail the compilation if something is wrong. So that's what we did. And in the first version, we didn't add a builder API. And now, 6 years later, no one asks about it anymore. So the primary takeaways from API section is that if you are in doubt, say no. You should always start with a no and then convince yourself to a yes. And if you're trying to solve a problem by adding a new API, it's more likely that you will end up with even more problems. This is because you initially didn't think about that use case or that API. And once you add it, there will be more cases you also didn't think about. Now, finally, like you don't need to make everyone happy, right? If someone asks about a functionality and you don't necessarily think is that important, don't. No, you don't need to convince everyone to use your library. And a practical tip here, there are these nice tools that you can attach to your build that will track your API surface. And if you change it by mistake or intentionally, it will change your file. You will realize it in your like pull request, and you'll be able to evaluate it. Now, let's talk about the feature requests and bugs. In terms of how you develop these libraries, you obviously need to have a plan upfront. You execute on that plan, and then you collect feedback from the developers, you revise it, and then iterate. This should be your main flow as you develop the libraries. And when you receive a feature request coming from people, oftentimes you will hear this one, oh, my feature is super important, you must implement this thing. Furthermore, if you don't implement it, I'm going to leave. I'm going to use this other thing. This happens a lot, and it's okay. Like, not everybody has to use your library. So you should be fine with this, as long as you don't agree with the feature, of course. And always keep in mind, having fewer features but well-thought features is a lot more important than having many half-baked features. And if you talk about the bug reports, when you receive a bug report, the first thing you must do is ask for an isolated repro. Like, unless you see the bug, it's very obvious what's wrong. Don't try to understand what is wrong if you didn't get it. Ask for an isolated repro. Now, this might sound harsh, but oftentimes what we observe is that when they try to create an isolated repro, they realize it's something else in their application causing the bug. So you completely avoid the problem, you save a lot of time. And even more controversial, like if that person is not going to spend the time to isolate it, you don't have to spend the time to figure out the bug. I'm not saying ignore your bugs, but you have a limited time. You have a bunch of features or other bugs that to work on. So while prioritizing these, you should better prioritize the things that are very clear and you can act on. This happens a lot in AndroidX. It also happened to me. This actually got a couple of weeks ago. Uh, I filed some bug on the Kotlin Gradle plugin. I think it was very obvious. So I just filed the bug and I was working something else and I moved on. Next morning, that was a message, hey, can you send a repro? And this is like, I felt a little bit ashamed because I'm always on the receiving end of these bugs and I should know better to file it properly. But I was busy, I didn't do it at the time. And then when I saw this message, I spent another like 10, 15 minutes, reproduce it, uploaded the sample. So I did my part as the reporter, and the maintainers are already working on the bug. So this is the like ultimate collaboration that you want to hit. So when you receive that nice bug reports, I highly recommend writing the failing test cases first. It's a like, perfect use case for doing test-driven development because you already know a use case that's failing. You should be able to write the test and reproduce it. And if you had that and then you fix the problem, that means you're confident that you actually made the test pass. But don't stop there because you obviously had that bug because you didn't think about something initially. So try to expand your test suite based on that new learning. What are the other cases you might have missed that look similar to this one? And then finally, try to learn from it. Like sometimes you get a bug because you didn't think anybody would do that. Maybe there was a better way to do it. Think about how you can improve your APIs or documentation to avoid similar problems. Now, speaking of testing, I'm not going to talk here that say like you must write tests, you must write tests. That's obvious. And there's like very simple trick to make that happen, in my opinion, and which is anytime you send a pull request, don't send it or don't approve it if it doesn't have accompanying tests. The way we do this in AndroidX is that every commit message needs to have this test section inside the message. And if you don't have it, like your pre-upload hook fails or your CI also fails. And this is very easy to fool. You can write there whatever you want, but it's just a simple reminder that this CL needs to have tests, unless it is something that doesn't like you fix documentation, so you don't need tests. And this might look very simple, but it has been very effective for us. In fact, when we first deployed this pre-submit hook, a bunch of people complained, and that's how we discovered who are those people who want to write the code without the tests. So this is a very effective trick to get into that state. But just because you're testing your library does not mean it is testable. So the way we define testability is the ability of developer that uses your library to write tests for the code sections that uses your library. So look at it this way. They use your library in some part of their code, and they want to write tests for that code. Keep in mind, these applications don't have access to your internal or private APIs, but they're also not trying to test your library. They're trying to test their own implementation. And we failed a lot in this section before. One of those was recycle-a-view. And so if you try to use recycle-a-view with Espresso in the early days, it completely didn't work. There's like blog posts, Stack Overflow questions, a ton of content around this. So what happened there? For those who don't know, Espresso is a testing framework. It gives you this functionality where you can like grab a view, like you can say, okay, grab the text, the view with this text and click on it. On the other hand, recycle-a-view is essentially a list view that represents a potentially infinite number of items. It only has views for those that are visible. So it has some concept of virtual views, which Espresso is not aware of. So if you wanted to use recycle-a-view with Espresso, it simply didn't work. Now, that was a workaround. You could add this like 100+ lines into your code base. It's very sad. We should have had this in day one. Later on, we did add this to Espresso, but this was a bad initial release. There are good examples too. Going back to Room, in Room we have this function where it lets you create your database in memory. Now we don't really think anybody will use any memory database in their application, but this is very good for testing, right? Like you can get a new instance of your database for every single test isolated from the other tests. Now, we don't just stop there. If there's a ton of documentation how to test your database implementations, how to test your migrations. We even have an extra artifact for that. And if you Google, you find them. So this is something very, very important to make sure your clients have a good user experience. Now, validating testability is actually very, very simple. Let's say if you're using Gradle, you create a new module in your project, call it the integration test app, uh, that needs to be a separate module. It has no private API access because it's in a separate module. And it's not trying to test your library. It has some usages of your library and tries to write tests for those usages. If you can get through it, that means your library is testable. If you cannot get through it, you have a problem to fix. Now, speaking of docs and samples, the primary thing with documentation, you need to have documentation in day one, but you should not stop with Java docs. I see this very commonly. They only have Java docs and they don't have any other documentation. That looks pretty bad. You must have like a very simple getting started section, maybe explain simple use cases with samples. You can even have like detailed pages for advanced use cases. Now, what happens when you have these is that when the developer comes to your library and they see this well-thought documentation, that gives them confidence. They realize that it's not somebody's weekend project. They're actually serious about this one. So it gives a lot of confidence to the developer in terms of using your library. And in terms of samples, obviously you need to have samples. Make sure they are simple. Like you should only include relevant things in those samples. They should be very easy to understand. And they don't need to be proper apps. This is the most common mistake I see. Like someone wrote a navigation library and the sample app has Dagger, it has database, it has networking. Like no one needs those to understand your navigation library. So remove as much as you can. Make sure it's very focused into your library and nothing else. And if you can do code labs, that's very, very effective. We do this in AndroidX. Even when someone new comes to the team, we ask them to go through the code labs. If you don't know what a code lab is like tutorials where you can do step-by-step instructions to get familiar with the library. Now, another one of my favorite things in AndroidX is the UX research we do. We do have a research team, and we always talk to developers about their experience on using particular libraries. There's a ton of these, and everybody has to do them, and it helps us a lot to find the right solutions. Now, in all likelihood, you don't have a UX research team, but there are very practical ways to do this without those resources. Main thing you can do is ask to interview your users. So if there's somebody filing out of bugs or feature requests, reach out to them, ask if they can spare half an hour, 45 minutes talking with you about their pain points, like what they were trying to do, what are the things they like in the library. You will learn a lot. The other thing you can ask people to do is ask them to keep a developer diary. So think it as they have a document as they try to use your library, and like they say, oh, I wanted to do this thing. I looked at here, it wasn't there. I looked at this other thing. So they just keep notes as they try to use your library. And this gives you a very, very good perspective because it's their first experience. And you will learn a lot from those documents. Now, you can also send surveys out to your clients. You need to be very clear on what they want, how they want to do it. And you should also include some demographic information about those clients. You realize that pro developers have really different expectations than a hobbyist developer. So being able to categorize this information is going to be very important. Now, finally, if you don't do any of those, at least when you receive bugs or feature requests, try to look at it from the experience perspective. Like, why did they hit that bug? Why did they think that would work if it's something you didn't think it should work? And try to learn from those bugs and feature requests and then include them in your planning for next versions. One minor thing I really wanted to mention is external dependencies in libraries. One primary rule you need to have, like, don't use latest tech in a library. If let's say you're writing a logging library and like a new RxJava just came out, don't try to use it immediately because you're basically increasing the risk of using your library unless you definitely need that dependency. Keep in mind, the more dependencies you have, the less adoption you will have because you are increasing the cost of adopting your library, so people will try to avoid using it. And last but not least, this is a little bit controversial, but you should sometimes reinvent the wheel, and that's okay. Now, I know it's always said, like, don't reinvent the wheel, which is because, like, the time you will spend inventing it, and then the time you'll have to spend maintaining it. But there might be cases where this makes sense. Something similar happened to us like a year ago or so. We were adding Kotlin symbol processing support to Room. So that's the new annotation processing replacement for Kotlin. And we need the library to run Kotlin compilation tests. There's a very nice library called Kotlin compile testing. We started using it and we contributed support for Kotlin symbol processing. It was fine initially, but keep in mind, during that development, KSP, the Kotlin symbol processing, was in active development, so you'll get a new version every other week. In AndroidX, we chase the latest Kotlin version, so whenever it comes out, you need to do something. So it was becoming very painful where Kotlin changes something or KSP changes something, we need to like change the library, wait for a release. You're basically waiting the release of 3 different things. At some point, we thought, okay, this doesn't really pay off anymore. We removed the library, implemented the parts we need, which it took me a day or 2 because I already knew how to do that, which we contributed that part to the library. And now, since then, every time we update Kotlin, it's very easy to fix the library and move on. So there might be cases where it makes sense to reinvent the wheel. Now, to sum up this, a couple major points I want to mention. First of all, don't get emotionally attached to your library. Like, everybody on the internet knows better than you do. Just accept it as a fact and enjoy the ride. Second, if you are receiving more bugs or more feature requests, that's not a failure. That's actually how success looks like. As more people adopt your library, you will get more feedback from them. And that's a very good thing. Third, try to be inclusive. So when you receive bug reports or feature requests, don't dismiss these people. Try to understand, because they might turn into your like next contributors. And sometimes like I see this a lot. People file a bug and they get a very annoying response from the owner of the library that completely turns off the person's any incentive to help the library. So don't be that person. Be inclusive. Like, help them so that they will help your library get better. Now, finally, you must have fun or at least learn something new, because unless you are getting paid, like I do, but otherwise, like, it should be fun. Doing libraries is a very good way to learn new stuff. All right, that's it. Thank you. I'll clap myself.
Am I back online? No, yes, Yigit, wave when you will be able to hear me.
Yes.
Awesome. Thank you for the presentation. You actually probably beat the record on amount of comments during the presentation. I just got an update from the team that we got some extra time for Q&A because there is no way we are going to fit in all the questions in like under 10 minutes. And I see a lot of claps, so that goes to you. It's virtual, but imagine clapping from the
I clap
real
myself
audience
at the end.
Yeah. So a couple of comments from my side before we are going to jump on the question. Something that struck me during your presentation, the quote from chat API, like kids, but they never leave your basement. Man, I have to put it on a wall somewhere, especially for people who write APIs. That was just brilliant. Thank you for that. If someone didn't tweet it yet, please do. That's just gold.
Okay. Yeah, I like that quote a lot. And he said in a very casual time in the office, I wrote it down as this is gold. It's very true.
Yeah, knowing Chad, he's like fairly good with producing quotable stuff in a random moment.
Yeah.
Another thing that like struck me is about documentation. And like, thanks for bringing this up. As like I already mentioned that during the live stream in my like before joining Facebook or Meta, I used to build libraries. We've been building an SDK that we were selling to our clients, and documentation was a game changer. Like when I joined the company, we had like one pager on GitHub, and that was about it. So like all documentations that we had. And the story behind was that we were trying to optimize the time to integrate SDK from near like 3 to 5 days in average for our clients to something under a day. And like as we added documentation and some additional like, automation to our build process, we cut it down to under 3 hours. It's like, thank you for bringing documentation. That was a huge win for us, and that's like one of the things that I really like to see more from people who build libraries. Please take a note. Okay, over to questions. The first question that I'd really like to discuss that people have been chatting over and over and over again. Why are we deprecating new APIs? Just like next version we are releasing them. Can you bring us some clarity on like what is the release cycle and like what is the deprecation policy for AndroidX libraries so people can know what to expect?
So the deprecation so in AndroidX libraries we follow semantic versioning, which means you have, let's say you have a version 2.3.5. So in the 0.51 you can only have bug fixes, you cannot have any API changes.
Okay.
The 0.31, so in the minor version you can add new APIs, you can deprecate stuff, but you cannot remove it. And if you wanted to remove an API, you have to make a major version bump. So it needs to go from 2 to 3 to do that. Now, the problem is in AndroidX, it is so hard to do a major version bump because AndroidX library is like a giant dependency tree, even within themselves.
I can imagine that part.
Yeah, do you want to break in Lifecycle API and move Lifecycles to version 3? You have to move rest of AndroidX to the next version. And then, like as you mentioned, you used to write libraries. Like people write libraries on top of these. They all have to bump major versions. So it's pretty much impossible. This is also why we are very conservative with APIs, because you can never remove them. Now, going back to deprecation, I mentioned this, like support library, is from 2011. That's really old. A lot has changed. Like I think you mentioned it earlier, like you don't use enums. Well, the world has changed.
Yep.
But that code cannot change. So one of the things we acted to do is that the APIs we did regret, we tried to deprecate them. Removing them is going to be really hard. But we'll try our best to deprecate them. That's very intentional because we really don't like those APIs. But we understand the cost. Like, trust me, we would be removing and deprecating a lot more APIs if we could. So what people see is just the tip of the iceberg that we think we can get away with. I'm sorry, I understand it's disruptive, but without doing that, the whole ecosystem will stagnate. And we cannot just think about the short term and completely ignore the long term.
Yeah, I am completely on the same page with you. And like I remember, like for us, like dependency tree was a pain in the ass to deal with, and just like updating libraries, and, like deprecating that was a showstopper. Like we were like very mindful with major version bumps. And like on the scale of AndroidX, I can imagine it's like 10 times, 100 times more complicated to small libraries.
Yeah, it's really sad. I mean, like I do really like library development, but one of the things I miss from my application development days is you could do whatever. You were like very fast, right?
So
like
true.
you have an idea because you can always go back and you can always change it. And here you cannot. So that's why, like in the early slides, I wanted to show the process is not that we like the process, is because we have so many regrets that it need to be as defensive as possible.
Yep, that's true. Like I'd sum it up as like when you're an application developer, you always try to use as latest libraries as possible, as latest thing as you can get your hands on. Like when you're building a library, it's on the other hand, like compatibility is your friend. Like that's the first thing you have to think of, and that puts like lots and lots of constraints on it, on what you can do. Very quick question before we are going to move to the next one. What API you regret the most?
Oh gosh, I need like a couple of days of list. I don't know. They asked this in the latest like IO roadshow like a month ago,
Okay.
and I don't really have a very particular API I regretted. But like one thing I kind of regret is that you remember the year we announced Kotlin supports. And that was also the year we announced the architecture components, which I was working on. And I really, really wanted to write them in Kotlin, but this was one of the things like we couldn't because the official support was likely to come, but the problem is that like the adoption takes time. We didn't want people to not use Room because it is in Kotlin because they were in Java, and a lot of people didn't trust Kotlin to succeed. So that's like I cannot call it a regret, but maybe it would be better if I wrote those libraries a year later so I could write them from scratch in Kotlin.
Yeah, it sounds like it was a bit ahead of time.
Yeah, sometimes you cannot we are actively trying to move libraries to Kotlin, but sometimes you cannot do that without breaking binary compatibility.
Again, compatibility constraints.
Yeah.
Yep. Yigit, we have a number of questions here. Like we'll probably leave that out for a breakout room. The one I'd like to finish with is how people can provide feedback to your team. Like what is the best channel to provide feedback on APIs, on new features? Like please don't deprecate kind of feedback. Like what is the most efficient channel to reach out to you and provide feedback?
Like Bugnizer is pretty good. Now, if you file bugs on the issue tracker, make sure you put them into the right components. And if you put it into the right component or anything under Jetpack, they're actively looked and triaged by the owners. I see some people complain because they filed under the base component and it goes through some contractors. Yeah, like people who don't know what we do. It takes a while to reach to us. It's actually happened to Jonathan recently. So make sure you pick the right component and then file the issue. But aside from that, all of our team tries to stay very active in the community. Like we chat people in Twitter. We are on Android study group. So if you want to provide feedback, I think it's possible. But also, please don't just go with questions or just go with complaints.
Makes sense.
It's important to
bring something constructive to the Bugnizer, and we can take a promise for you on a live stream to look into that. That someone from the team is going to look into that.
Yeah, feel free to shame me if we didn't. We
no,
really try to stay on top of them. But it needs to come to the right component, otherwise we don't even see it.
Okay, Yigit. We are over time. Thank you so much for a presentation, for a live stream. You're joining breakout rooms, so folks whose questions were not answered just yet, give Yigit a break. And in a moment or so, he's going to join breakout rooms to answer all of your questions. And from my side, thank you. I really loved your presentation. APIs is I have love and hate relationship with them. Thank you for that.